A racist neighbor vandalized a black family's car, believing his act would go unnoticed, but he had no idea who these people really turned out to be. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching this from. The morning sun glinted off the moving truck as it pulled into the quiet suburban cul-de-sac. The rhythmic hum of the engine came to a halt, and, for a moment, the street stood silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. A sleek black SUV followed closely behind, parking neatly in the driveway of a modest two-story home with a white picket fence and neatly trimmed hedges. Brian Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, stepped out of the driver's seat, pausing for a moment to take in the view of their new home. He ran a hand over his short, neatly trimmed hair and exhaled slowly. "Here we are," he said, a soft smile playing on his lips as he turned to look at his wife, Monica, who emerged from the passenger side, stretching her arms and shaking off the stiffness of the drive. "It's beautiful," I said, her voice filled with quiet awe. Her eyes traced the contours of the house, the sun glinting off the large bay windows, the freshly painted shutters, and the cobblestone path leading to the front door. I can't believe we finally did it." From the back seat, their 8-year-old daughter, Thea, bounced out with boundless energy. Her curly hair framed her round face as she spun around in excitement, clutching a stuffed bear tightly in one hand. "This is it? This is our new house?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with wonder. Ryan chuckled. "This is it, princess. What do you think?" Thea didn't answer. Instead, she darted toward the house, pressing her face against one of the large windows and squinting to see inside. "It's huge! Can I pick my room first?" "Let's at least get the boxes inside first," Monica said, laughing as she grabbed a small bag from the trunk. "We have a lot of unpacking to do before you start claiming rooms." Ryan turned to the movers who had begun unloading the truck, directing them toward the front door. He couldn't shake the mixture of pride and relief swelling in his chest. This move symbolized a fresh start, a place where they could leave behind the challenges of the bustling city and build something better for their daughter. But as Ryan was helping to unload a heavy box from the back of the truck, he felt the sensation of being watched. He glanced up, his eyes catching a figure standing across the street. A man, likely in his 50s, with thinning hair and a slight stoop, leaned against a gate, staring at them intently. Dressed in a faded plaid shirt and khakis, the man's expression was unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile, but oddly fixed. Ryan offered a polite nod, but the man didn't return it. Instead, he turned and walked back into his yard, closing the gate behind him with a deliberate click. Ryan frowned but brushed off the encounter. As the day wore on, the family settled into their new home. Thea darted up and down the stairs, exploring every corner, while Monica unpacked kitchen supplies and set about arranging furniture. Ryan busied himself with the heavier tasks, bringing in boxes and assembling Thea's bed. He caught glimpses of the neighborhood through the windows. Manicured lawns, kids riding bikes, and a sense of orderliness that felt like the perfect environment for Thea to grow up in. By mid-afternoon, Monica prepared a light lunch and called them all to the dining table, which was still surrounded by unpacked boxes. "A toast," she said, raising her glass of lemonade, "to new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Ryan echoed, clinking his glass against hers. Thea raised her cup of juice and joined in, giggling as the cups clinked loudly. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan stepped outside to take in the cool evening air. The quiet was almost unsettling after the constant noise of the city, but he relished it. He glanced across the street and saw the same man from earlier, this time sitting on his porch with a cup of something steaming. Ryan decided to cross the street. "Evening," Ryan said, his voice warm but cautious as he approached the gate. The man looked up from his cup, his lips twitching into what might have been a polite smile but didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening," he replied. "I'm Ryan," he said, extending a hand. "We just moved in across the street." The man looked at Ryan's hand for a moment before shaking it briefly. "Greg," he said. His grip was firm but perfunctory. "Welcome to the neighborhood." "Thanks," Ryan said, glancing around. "It's a nice place. My wife and daughter are already in love with it." Greg nodded but said nothing, his eyes drifting toward the house. "Not a lot of newcomers around here," he finally said, his tone neutral. Ryan caught the undertone but decided to ignore it. "Well, we're looking forward to getting to know everyone. It's a big change from the city." "Sure," Greg said shortly. He took a sip from his cup and stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Good night," he said before heading inside. Ryan returned to his house, unsettled but determined not to overthink it. He's just a quiet guy, he told himself. Probably not used to new faces. Inside, Monica was arranging books on a shelf, while Thea lay on the living room floor, coloring in a notebook. "Everything okay out there?" Monica asked, glancing at him. "Yeah," Ryan said, shrugging. "Just met one of the neighbors, quiet type." Monica gave him a knowing look. "Quiet or weird?" Ryan chuckled. "Maybe a little of both, nothing to worry about." But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's demeanor was more than just quiet indifference. Something about the way he had looked at the house, at them, lingered in his mind. The next morning, Ryan woke to Monica's voice calling him from the front yard. "Ryan, come here." He hurried outside to find her standing on the lawn, pointing at a pile of garbage scattered across the grass, crumpled papers, empty cans, and other debris. "What is this?" she asked, her tone a mix of anger and disbelief. Ryan frowned, scanning the area. "I don't know. Maybe kids messing around?" "Kids?" Monica said, crossing her arms. "In a neighborhood like this?" Ryan glanced across the street, but Greg's yard was empty. The house was silent, the curtains drawn. He shook his head and sighed. "I'll clean it up," he said. "Let's not jump to conclusions." But as he bent down to pick up the trash, Ryan couldn't help but feel that it wasn't an accident. Someone had gone out of their way to disrupt their fresh start. And across the street, behind the drawn curtains of his home, Greg watched, his expression cold and unreadable. The morning after the garbage incident, Ryan woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, save for the faint rustling of the trees outside and the occasional chirping of birds. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying yesterday's events in his mind. Something about the trash strewn across their lawn didn't sit right with him. Monica's reaction, though sharper than his own, was justified. This was supposed to be their peaceful escape, a place to rebuild. Instead, it felt like they were already being targeted. When he finally got out of bed, he found Monica in the kitchen, sipping coffee while scrolling through her phone. She looked up at him, her face softening from its earlier tension. "Morning," she said, sliding a cup of coffee toward him. "Morning," Ryan replied, sitting down across from her. "Did you sleep okay?" She shrugged. "I kept thinking about yesterday. You really think it was just kids?" Ryan paused, considering his answer. He didn't want to worry her, but he also couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not going to let it bother us. Let's just keep an eye out, okay?" Monica nodded, but her expression remained troubled. By the time Thea woke up, the mood in the house had shifted. Her cheerful chatter about her new room and plans to decorate it filled the air, momentarily pushing aside the unease. Ryan couldn't help but smile as she described how she wanted to paint her walls the color of sunshine. After breakfast, the family decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to explore. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds bursting with color. It was idyllic, almost unnervingly so. Ryan held Thea's hand while Monica walked beside him, her eyes scanning the homes they passed. They stopped to chat briefly with a middle-aged couple gardening in their front yard. The couple, Mark and Linda, were warm and friendly, offering tips about the best local grocery stores and restaurants. "You'll love it here," Linda said, wiping dirt from her hands. "It's such a quiet, safe neighborhood." Ryan smiled politely, but he couldn't help but wonder if everyone felt the same way. As they continued their walk, Ryan noticed Greg standing in his driveway, tinkering with a lawnmower. Their eyes met briefly, but Greg didn't wave or acknowledge him. Instead, he turned his attention back to the machine, muttering something under his breath. "Is that him?" Monica whispered, leaning closer to Ryan. "Yeah," Ryan replied. "That's Greg." Monica frowned. "He doesn't look very friendly." Ryan gave a non-committal shrug. "Let's not jump to conclusions." The walk ended without incident, and they spent the rest of the day unpacking boxes and setting up the house. By evening, Ryan felt the weight of the day catching up to him. He settled into the couch with a beer, scrolling aimlessly on his phone, while Monica read a book nearby. Thea was upstairs, already asleep after an exhausting day. Just as Ryan was beginning to relax, the doorbell rang. The sound startled both him and Monica. They exchanged a glance before Ryan stood up, setting his beer on the coffee table. "I'll get it," he said, heading toward the door. When he opened it, he found Greg standing on the porch. He was holding a small plate covered with aluminum foil. His expression was neutral, but there was a stiffness in his posture that made Ryan instantly wary. "Evening," Greg said, his tone clipped. "I thought I'd bring this over as a welcome gesture." He held out the plate. Ryan hesitated for a moment before accepting it. Thanks," he said, peeling back the foil slightly to reveal a stack of cookies. "You didn't have to do this." "Just being neighborly," Greg replied, though there was no warmth in his voice. His eyes darted past Ryan into the house, lingering for a moment before snapping back to Ryan. "Nice place you've got here." "Thanks," Ryan said, his tone cautious. "We're still getting settled." Oh, Greg nodded, his gaze flickering to something over Ryan's shoulder. "Well, don't let me keep you," he said abruptly. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back to his house. Ryan closed the door, frowning as he stared down at the plate of cookies. Something about the encounter felt off, like an undercurrent of hostility disguised as politeness. "Who was it?" Monica asked, looking up from her book. "Greg," Ryan said, setting the plate on the counter. "He brought cookies." Monica raised an eyebrow. "Cookies? That's unexpected." "Yeah," Ryan muttered, staring at the plate. "Unexpected." The next morning, Monica stepped outside to retrieve the mail and froze. Her eyes widened as she saw a pile of garbage on their lawn again. This time, it was worse. Empty bottles, crumpled newspapers, and what looked like an old, torn shirt. "Ryan," she called, her voice sharp with anger. Ryan came rushing out, his face darkening when he saw the mess. He scanned the street, but everything was quiet. Greg's house was as still as it had been the day before. "This isn't random," Monica said, crossing her arms. "This is deliberate." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll clean it up," he said. "Let's not escalate things." But as he bent down to pick up the trash, his frustration grew. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the implication. Whoever was doing this wanted them to feel unwelcome, to question their decision to move here, and it was working. That evening, Ryan decided to confront Greg. He waited until dusk, watching from the living room window as Greg stepped outside to check his mailbox. Ryan grabbed his jacket and headed across the street, his steps purposeful. "Greg," he called as he approached. Greg turned, his expression neutral. "Evening." Ryan stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble, but we've had garbage dumped on our lawn twice now. I just want to know if you've seen anything." Greg's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment he didn't answer. "Garbage, huh?" he said finally. "That's unfortunate." "Yeah, it is," Ryan said, keeping his tone even. "If you happen to see anything, I'd appreciate it if you let us know." Greg shrugged. "I'll keep an eye out." There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Greg smirked. "Funny thing about new neighborhoods," he said. "Not everyone fits in right away." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We're not looking for trouble. We just want to be good neighbors." "Sure," Greg said, his tone dripping with insincerity. "Good luck with that." Ryan turned and walked back to his house, his fists clenched at his sides. As he stepped inside, Monica looked up from the kitchen, her expression questioning. "Well?" she asked. Ryan shook his head. "Nothing useful." But deep down he knew Greg was involved, and he knew this was just the beginning. The tension in the Carter household was palpable. Days had passed since Ryan's tense encounter with Greg, and though no more garbage had appeared on their lawn, the air felt thick with unspoken hostility. Monica grew more unsettled with each passing day, her eyes darting toward the windows every time she heard footsteps or cars passing by. Thea, thankfully, seemed blissfully unaware, spending her afternoons painting in her room or riding her bike in the driveway under her parents' watchful eyes. Ryan, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. Greg's parting words from their last conversation lingered in his mind. Funny thing about new neighborhoods. Not everyone fits in right away. It wasn't a threat outright, but it felt like one, a subtle, calculated dig meant to unsettle him. One evening, after tucking Thea into bed, Ryan joined Monica in the living room. She sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Ryan sank into the armchair across from her, his brow furrowed. "Still nothing on the cameras?" Monica asked without looking up. Ryan shook his head. He had installed a small security camera over the garage just days after the second trash incident, hoping to catch whoever was responsible. No, nothing but the mailman and some kids riding bikes. Monica sighed, setting her phone down on the coffee table. I don't get it, Ryan. Why us? We haven't done anything to anyone." Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not about what we've done, Monica. It's about what we represent." Monica nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Do you think it's him? Greg?" "I don't know," Ryan admitted, though deep down he was almost certain. "But I can't prove it." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their shared unease settling between them. Let's just get some rest. Monica finally said, standing up and stretching. Gah, tomorrow's another day. Ryan nodded, though he doubted sleep would come easily. That night, Ryan woke with a start. He wasn't sure what had roused him, a noise, a movement, or simply the lingering stress that clung to him like a second skin. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 2:17 a.m. He sat up slowly, listening. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Monica stirred beside him but didn't wake. Ryan rubbed his eyes and swung his legs over the side of the bed, deciding to check the house. Something felt off. He moved through the darkened hallway, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The faint glow of the porch light filtered through the curtains as he descended the stairs. He checked the locks on the front and back doors, all secure. But as he passed by the living room window, something outside caught his eye. He froze. Across the street near Greg's house, a figure moved in the shadows. Ryan squinted, trying to make out the details, but the figure was obscured by the darkness. They appeared to be carrying something, a bag perhaps, and their movements were deliberate, almost methodical. Ryan's heart raced as he reached for his phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He opened the security camera app and switched to the live feed of the driveway. At first, the screen showed nothing unusual, just the faint outline of the yard, bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. But then, as he scanned the feed, a figure came into view. It wasn't Greg. The person was crouched near Ryan's car, their face obscured by a hood. In one hand they held a spray can, shaking it vigorously. Ryan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the person lean forward and begin spraying something onto the side of the car. Without thinking, Ryan bolted for the front door. He yanked it open and stormed outside, his voice cutting through the still night. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The figure froze for a split second before scrambling to their feet and darting toward the street. Ryan chased after them, adrenaline surging through his veins. He caught a fleeting glimpse of their face as they glanced back. A young man, maybe early 20s, his expression twisted in panic. Ryan's bare feet slapped against the pavement as he pursued the intruder, but the man was fast. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ryan standing in the middle of the street, panting and frustrated. It was only then that Ryan realized Greg was standing on his porch, a mug in hand. He hadn't been there moments ago, and Ryan wondered how long he'd been watching. Greg smirked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Everything all right over there?" Ryan's fists clenched at his sides. "You saw him, didn't you?" Greg shrugged. "I heard some noise, stepped outside to see what was going on. Didn't see much, though." Ryan took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You expect me to believe that? You didn't see the guy spraying my car?" Greg raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, don't look at me. I'm just the neighbor. Maybe you should invest in better security." Before Ryan could respond, Greg turned and disappeared back into his house, leaving Ryan fuming on the sidewalk. When Ryan finally returned to his own driveway, he saw the damage clearly for the first time. The side of his car was covered in crude, racist graffiti, the hateful words glowing faintly under the porch light. His stomach churned with anger and disgust. Monica appeared at the door, her face pale with worry. "Ryan, what happened? I heard yelling." Ryan gestured toward the car, his voice tight. "Someone sprayed this on the car." Monica's hands flew to her mouth as she took in the sight. "Oh my God!" Ryan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I'm calling the police." By the time the officers arrived, the graffiti had begun to drip in streaks down the side of the car. Ryan explained what had happened, showing them the security footage he'd captured. but the image of the intruder's face was too blurry to make out any identifying details. "We'll file a report," one of the officers said, his tone professional but detached. "If you see or hear anything else, give us a call." Ryan's jaw tightened. "That's it? A report?" The officer met his gaze evenly. "Unless we can identify the suspect or get a clearer video, there's not much else we can do." As the police car pulled away, Ryan stood in the driveway, his fists clenched at his sides. Monica placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "We can't let this slide, Ryan. Whoever did this, they're trying to intimidate us." Ryan nodded, his resolve hardening. "They want us to feel unwelcome, but I'm not going to let them win." He spent the rest of the night scrubbing the paint off the car as best he could, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Across the street, Greg's house remained dark, the curtains drawn, but Ryan knew he was watching. And Ryan knew, without a doubt, that Greg's involvement ran deeper than he was letting on. The Katas had moved here for peace, for a chance to start over. But now, Ryan realized, they had stepped into a battle they hadn't expected, and he was determined to fight back. The morning light seeped through the curtains, painting the walls in muted gold, as Ryan sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of coffee. Monica sat across from him, her face pale and drawn. She had hardly spoken since the incident the night before. The graffiti had been a cruel reminder of the hostility simmering just beneath the surface of their idyllic new neighborhood. Thea's soft humming floated down the stairs, a fragile contrast to the tension that filled the room. Ryan glanced at Monica, who stared into her cup, her brow furrowed. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. Monica looked up at him, her eyes weary. "Figure out what, Ryan? Who did it? Why? Or how to protect Thea from all of this?" "All of it," Ryan said firmly. "I'm not going to let them think they've won. Whoever's doing this wants us to feel scared, like we don't belong here, but they don't get to decide that." Monica nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain. "Just be careful. I don't want this to escalate." Ryan promised her he would, but deep down he knew the situation had already escalated. He wasn't just fighting for their place in the neighborhood, he was fighting for their dignity. After dropping Thea off at school, Ryan drove to the local hardware store and picked up additional security cameras. The single camera over the garage clearly wasn't enough, and he wanted to cover every possible angle. He spent the better part of the morning installing them, meticulously adjusting their positions and testing the feeds on his phone. Each step felt like a small victory, a way to regain a sense of control. Once the cameras were set up, Ryan turned his attention to gathering evidence. He began by reviewing the footage from the night before, hoping to find some detail he might have missed in the heat of the moment. The grainy image of the hooded figure appeared again, and though their face was still obscured, Ryan noticed something new, a patch on the intruder's jacket, faint but distinct. He zoomed in as much as he could, straining to make out the details. The patch was circular, with bold letters around the edge. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but it was a lead. Ryan took a screenshot and saved it on his phone. Next, he decided to canvass the neighborhood. He started with the house closest to theirs, a modest brick home with a wide front porch. The door was answered by an older woman with a kind face and sharp eyes. "Good morning," Ryan said, offering a polite smile. "I'm Ryan Carter. My family and I just moved in across the street." The woman nodded, her expression softening. I've seen you around. I'm Mrs. Harris. What can I do for you? Ryan hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to share. There was an incident at our house last night. Someone vandalized my car, and I was wondering if you might have seen or heard anything. Mrs. Harris's face darkened. I didn't see anything last night, but I've heard stories about this sort of thing happening before. Some folks around here don't take kindly to newcomers, especially, well, you know. Ryan nodded, his jaw tightening. Do you know who might be behind it? Mrs. Harris sighed. I couldn't say for sure, but, Greg? He's been here a long time, always had his opinions about who belongs and who doesn't. I'd keep an eye on him. Ryan thanked her and moved on to the next house, but the responses were largely the same. Polite, sympathy, vague hints about Greg's behavior, and a clear reluctance to get involved. As the day wore on, Ryan's frustration grew. Everyone seemed to know something, but no one was willing to speak up. He felt like he was running in circles, chasing shadows, while Greg sat comfortably in his home, likely laughing at Ryan's efforts. By late afternoon, Ryan decided to change tactics. He reached out to a colleague, Marcus Reed, a civil rights activist and former investigator. Marcus had helped Ryan with difficult cases in the past, and Ryan trusted his instincts. Sounds like a mess, Marcus said, after Ryan finished explaining the situation. But you're right to want to get ahead of it. Let me dig around and see what I can find. Sometimes people like Greg leave a trail. Ryan felt a glimmer of hope as he hung up the phone. If anyone could uncover useful information, it was Marcus. That evening, as Ryan sat in his home office reviewing documents for an upcoming case, his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It contained a single link and the message, "You need to see this." Ryan clicked the link, which led to a local forum thread. The posts were filled with heated comments, some praising Greg for standing up for the neighborhood, and others condemning him for his alleged actions. One post, however, caught Ryan's eye. A photo of Greg from several years ago, standing with a group of men outside a bar. The patch on Greg's jacket was identical to the one Ryan had seen on the intruder in his security footage. Ryan's pulse quickened as he studied the photo. It was confirmation. Greg wasn't just a passive observer. He was involved. Fueled by this new evidence, Ryan decided it was time to confront Greg directly. He stepped outside, the cool night air biting against his skin. Across the street, Greg's house was dark except for a faint glow in the living room window. Ryan marched up the driveway and knocked firmly on the door. It took several moments before Greg answered, his expression a mixture of annoyance and amusement. "Evening," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I think we need to talk," Ryan said, his tone calm but firm. Greg raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "You know about what," Ryan replied, holding up his phone to show the photo. "This was you, wasn't it? Or at least someone you know." Greg's smirk faltered for a split second before returning. "That's a pretty serious accusation, neighbor." "It's not an accusation," Ryan said. "It's a fact, and I'm not going to let this slide." Greg's expression hardened and he took a step forward, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Listen here, Carter. You think you're better than the rest of us, moving in with your fancy car and your self-righteous attitude. But you don't belong here. People like you never do." Ryan's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to back down. "This isn't about me, Greg. It's about right and wrong, and you're on the wrong side." The tension between them crackled like electricity, but before Greg could respond, a voice called out from down the street. "Hey, what's going on over there?" Ryan turned to see Mrs. Harris standing on her porch, her sharp eyes trained on them. Greg muttered something under his breath and stepped back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Ryan exhaled slowly, his hands still trembling. He knew this wasn't the end. Greg was cornered now, and cornered men were dangerous. But Ryan also knew he couldn't stop. The search for truth had only just begun. The morning after Ryan's confrontation with Greg, the tension in the Carter household was nearly palpable. Monica had woken early and busied herself in the kitchen, the clinking of plates and the hum of the coffee machine filling the otherwise silent house. Ryan sat at the dining table, staring at his laptop screen, his mind consumed by everything he had uncovered so far. The photo Marcus had sent was damning, and though Greg had denied everything, Ryan knew he was lying. Monica set a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, her hand brushing his shoulder. "You barely slept last night," she said softly. "I couldn't," Ryan admitted. "We're not dealing with some petty vandal here. Greg's part of something bigger, and if we don't stop this now, it's only going to get worse." Monica sat down across from him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "What's your next move?" Ryan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I've got enough to expose him. The photo, the footage, everything lines up. But I need to make sure it sticks. If we go public, it has to be undeniable." Monica nodded. "Then let's do it. But Ryan, promise me you'll be careful. This isn't just about proving a point anymore. It's about protecting our family." Ryan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I know, and I promise I'm not going to let anything happen to us." That afternoon, Ryan called Marcus to discuss his plan. They agreed that the best way to expose Greg was to do it publicly, where he couldn't wiggle out of accountability. Marcus suggested organizing a neighborhood meeting, ostensibly to address community concerns, but with the real purpose of revealing Greg's involvement in the vandalism. "You'll need to keep it professional," Marcus warned. "Stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself. If you come across as too emotional, it'll give him room to undermine you." Ryan agreed, though he knew it would be easier said than done. The anger and frustration he felt toward Greg were like a storm brewing inside him, but he had to keep it contained. The next step was rallying support. Ryan spent the next few days visiting neighbors, sharing what he had uncovered, and encouraging them to attend the meeting. Some were reluctant, clearly afraid of getting involved, but others were more receptive. Mrs. Harris was particularly supportive, promising to spread the word among the older residents. "I've lived here long enough to see the kind of man Greg is," she said firmly. "It's about time someone stood up to him." By the day of the meeting, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. The community center was filled with residents, their murmurs creating a low hum of anticipation. Ryan stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding as he surveyed the crowd. Monica sat in the front row with Thea, her steady gaze giving him the strength he needed. When Greg arrived, he strode in with an air of defiance, his expression cold and dismissive. He took a seat near the back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Ryan cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "I called this meeting because our neighborhood is facing a problem, one that threatens the very sense of community we all value." He clicked a remote and the projector behind him lit up, displaying the security footage from the night of the vandalism. Gasps rippled through the audience as the hooded figure came into view. "This footage was captured outside my home," Ryan continued. "It shows someone defacing my car with hateful, racist graffiti, and while their face is obscured, there's one detail that stood out." He clicked again, zooming in on the patch on the intruder's jacket. Then he switched to the photo Marcus had found, showing Greg wearing the same jacket with the same patch. "You've got to be kidding me," Greg said loudly, rising to his feet. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Ryan asked, turning to face him. "Because this isn't just about a jacket. It's about a pattern of behavior. You've been harassing my family since the day we moved in, and now we have proof." The room fell silent as the weight of Ryan's words sank in. Greg's face turned red and his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You think you're so clever," Greg spat, "coming in here with your big city attitude, trying to make me out to be the bad guy, but you don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Ryan shot back. "I know you've been trying to intimidate us, to make us feel like we don't belong here, but it's not going to work." Greg's laughter was bitter and hollow. "You really think anyone here cares? This neighborhood has always looked out for its own, and you're just an outsider." "That's where you're wrong," a voice called from the crowd. Mrs. Harris stood, her posture straight and unyielding. "This isn't about where someone comes from. It's about right and wrong. And what you've done, Greg, is wrong." Others in the audience began murmuring in agreement, their voices growing louder until they drowned out Greg's protests. "You can't prove anything," Greg said, his voice rising in desperation. Ryan held up a folder filled with documents. "Maybe not in court, but this isn't about legal proof, Greg. This isn't about accountability. And now everyone here knows the truth." Greg stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the tense silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Harris stepped forward, placing a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said softly. Ryan nodded, though the weight of the confrontation still pressed heavily on him. He knew this wasn't the end. Greg wouldn't go down quietly, and there was still the question of how to rebuild the trust and safety that had been shattered. That night, as the family sat together in the living room, Ryan felt a sense of relief, tempered by uncertainty. He had exposed Greg, but the fallout remained to be seen. "You were amazing today," Monica said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Thanks," Ryan said, wrapping an arm around her. "But it's not over. We have to stay vigilant." Monica nodded. "We will, together." As Thea played quietly with her toys on the rug, Ryan allowed himself a small moment of hope. They had faced the darkness and brought it into the light. Now they just had to keep moving forward. The days following the public confrontation were tense. Word of the neighborhood meeting and Greg's exposure spread quickly, not just among the residents but through social media as well. Ryan had expected pushback, but he hadn't anticipated the sheer volume of it. His inbox was flooded with messages, some supportive, others dripping with vitriol. The worst were anonymous threats, vague but unsettling. "Watch your back. You don't belong here. Should have stayed where you came from." Monica insisted on reporting them to the police, but Ryan knew they'd offer little more than a perfunctory investigation. Greg, meanwhile, had vanished from sight. His curtains remained drawn, and his car didn't move from the driveway. Some neighbors whispered that he was too humiliated to show his face, while others speculated he was planning his next move. Ryan didn't know which possibility was worse. One morning, as Ryan sipped his coffee in the kitchen, Thea bounded in, her curls bouncing as she held up a drawing. "Daddy, look! I made a picture of us." Ryan took the paper and smiled. The drawing showed their family standing in front of their house, Thea's wide smile taking up most of her face, but in the background near a darkened window was a figure with scribbled lines for eyes staring at them. "What's this, sweetheart?" Ryan asked, pointing to the figure. Thea tilted her head. That's the man who looks at us from across the street. Ryan's chest tightened. What do you mean, baby? When did you see him? Sometimes when I'm playing outside, she said nonchalantly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. He stands in his window and watches. Ryan exchanged a worried glance with Monica, who had walked in just in time to hear. She mouthed, Greg. That afternoon, Marcus called with an update. I did some more digging, Marcus said, his voice low and serious. Greg's history is uglier than we thought. He's been involved in similar incidents before, harassing other families, mostly people of color, but he's always managed to avoid serious consequences. Ryan leaned against the counter, his grip tightening on the phone. How? Like, how does someone like him keep getting away with it? Connections, Mako replied. He's got a cousin in the local police department. Plus, a lot of his victims never pressed charges. Either they were too scared or they just wanted to move on. Ryan's jaw clenched. Well, we're not moving on. Not until he's held accountable. There's one more thing, Marcus said. I found a few posts on some, let's call them questionable forums. He's been active in these groups, talking about preserving the integrity of the neighborhood. It's dog whistle racism, plain and simple. Ryan exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Send me everything you've got. You got it. And Ryan? Be careful. Guys like Greg don't just give up when they're cornered. That evening, Ryan shared everything Marcus had uncovered with Monica. They sat at the dining table, their voices hushed, despite Thea being upstairs in her room. Is there any way we can get him arrested? Monica asked, her tone equal parts frustration and desperation. He's harassing us, threatening us. What more does he have to do? We don't have enough evidence for that, Ryan admitted. But if we keep pushing, we might find something that sticks. Monica sighed, rubbing her temples. And in the meantime, what if he escalates? What if he... Her voice broke, and she shook her head. I just want to keep Thea safe. We will, Ryan said, his voice firm. I promise. Late that night, as the neighborhood lay quiet, Ryan sat in his home office, scrolling through the forums Marcus had mentioned. The posts Greg had written were thinly veiled diatribes about protecting community values and preserving tradition. The rhetoric was infuriatingly familiar, cloaked in civility but seething with hate. One post, however, stood out. It was dated just a few days before the vandalism, and it read, "Sometimes you have to remind people where they stand. Actions speak louder than words." Ryan stared at the words, his stomach twisting. It wasn't an admission, but it was close enough. He saved the screenshot and forwarded it to Marcus. The sound of glass shattering broke the silence, jolting Ryan from his thoughts. He bolted out of his chair and ran downstairs, where Monica was already standing in the living room, her hand covering her mouth. One of the front windows was broken, shards of glass scattered across the floor. A large brick lay in the middle of the room, a crude note taped to it. Get out. Ryan's heart pounded as he looked from the note to Monica, whose face was pale with fear. Is Thea okay? He asked, his voice urgent. Monica nodded. She's still asleep. She didn't hear it. Ryan's hands trembled as he called the police, his anger barely contained. When the officers arrived, they took the report with the same detached professionalism as before. One of them, a young man with a kind face, offered a quiet word of advice as he handed Ryan a copy of the report. Keep documenting everything, he said. If it happens again, you'll need all the evidence you can get. The next day, Ryan decided enough was enough. He contacted a local journalist, a woman named Lisa Vega, who had covered similar stories of harassment and systemic bias. Lisa agreed to meet him at a nearby coffee shop where he laid out everything he had: the footage, the photos, the forum posts. And now the brick. "This is a pattern," Ryan said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's not just about us. Greg has been doing this for years, and no one's held him accountable. That needs to change." Lisa nodded, her pen flying across her notebook. "This is powerful stuff, Ryan, but you need to be ready for the blowback. Stories like this don't just expose one person. They expose a system, and systems fight back." "I know," Ryan said, "but if we don't do this, he'll just keep doing it to someone else." The article was published 2 days later, its headline bold and unflinching: "A Neighborhood Divided. The Fight Against Racism in Suburbia." It detailed Ryan's experience, the history of Greg's behavior, and the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. Support poured in from activists, community leaders, and strangers who shared similar stories. But there was also backlash, an avalanche of hateful comments and emails accusing Ryan of stirring up trouble, of playing the victim. Greg, predictably, denied everything. He released a statement through a lawyer, calling the article baseless and accusing Ryan of trying to smear his name. But the evidence was too damning to ignore. Local organizations began mobilizing, calling for investigations into Greg and his connections within the police department. A protest was organized outside Greg's house, drawing both supporters and counter-protesters. The once quiet neighborhood was now a battleground. One evening, as Ryan sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Monica and Thea, Mrs. Harris walked over. She carried a small plate of cookies, her face kind but weary. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Ryan," she said, handing him the plate. "I know," Ryan replied, "but it needed stirring." Mrs. Harris smiled faintly. "You've got more allies than you think. Don't forget that." As she walked away, Ryan looked at Monica, who nodded in silent agreement. They weren't alone in this fight, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew they were on the right side of history. Greg had tried to intimidate them, to drive them out, but instead he had ignited something far more powerful: a community's demand for justice. The protests outside Greg's house stretched into the following days, drawing more attention than anyone in the neighborhood could have anticipated. Local news vans parked along the street, reporters with microphones interviewed residents and activists, and the once quiet cul-de-sac buzzed with voices demanding justice. For Ryan and Monica, it was a surreal transformation of the place they had chosen to call home. Greg's house remained a fortress. The curtains were perpetually drawn, and no one had seen him leave since the protests began. The weight of public scrutiny seemed to press harder on his shoulders with each passing day, but Ryan knew the battle wasn't over. Greg had allies, some in the neighborhood and others in positions of power, and their resistance was growing louder. One morning, as Ryan sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Marcus called with news. "They're opening an investigation into Greg," Marcus said. "The forum posts, the connections to previous incidents, it's all too much to ignore. And get this, his cousin in the department is being put on leave." Ryan's shoulders sagged with relief, but he tempered his reaction. "That's a start, but I won't celebrate until we see real accountability." "You're right," Marcus said, "but you've done something big here, Ryan. Don't forget that." Ryan hung up and glanced across the street where the protesters had begun to gather again. Signs reading "No place for hate" and "Justice for all" bobbed in the air. He couldn't help but feel a swell of gratitude for the people who had stood by his side, even when it would have been easier to stay silent. That afternoon, Monica found Ryan in the kitchen scrolling through his phone. "Hey," she said, leaning against the counter. "Thea wants to go to the park. I thought it might be good for all of us to get some fresh air." Ryan hesitated, his mind still occupied with the weight of the fight, but as he looked at Monica's tired eyes, he realized how much they all needed a break. "Yeah," he said, setting his phone down. "Let's go." The park was a short drive away, a sprawling green space with winding trails and a large playground. Thea ran ahead as soon as they arrived, her laughter ringing out as she climbed onto the jungle gym. For a moment, Ryan and Monica sat on a bench, soaking in the rare tranquility. "This is nice," Monica said softly. "Almost normal." Ryan nodded. "I'd forgotten what that feels like." As they watched Thea play, a voice called out from behind them, "Ryan?" They turned to see Lisa Vega, the journalist who had written the article exposing Greg. She smiled as she approached, a camera slung over her shoulder. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Trying to take a breather," Ryan said, shaking her hand. "Thanks again for everything you've done." Lisa waved off the thanks. "You're the one who's done the heavy lifting, but I wanted to let you know there's going to be a follow-up piece. More people have come forward about Greg, and it's painting a pretty damning picture." Ryan felt a flicker of satisfaction. Good. People need to know the truth. "They will," Lisa promised. "But you should also know there's a lot of support for you and your family. I've been getting emails and messages from people all over saying how much your story means to them." Monica smiled, her hand resting on Ryan's arm. "Oh, that's good to hear." As Lisa walked away, Ryan felt a sense of validation he hadn't expected. Their fight was resonating beyond their neighborhood, becoming part of a larger movement. It wasn't just about Greg anymore. It was about challenging the systems that allowed people like him to thrive. That evening, as the family returned home, something unexpected happened. Greg emerged from his house. Ryan froze on the sidewalk, his protective instincts kicking in as he watched Greg approach. But the man's demeanor was different. His shoulders slumped, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. He looked smaller, almost deflated. "I want to talk," Greg said, his voice low. Monica glanced at Ryan, her eyes narrowing. "You have a lot of nerve." Ryan held up a hand, silencing her. "What do you want, Greg?" Greg exhaled heavily, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape route. "I messed up," he said finally. "I know I did, and I need to make it right." Ryan's jaw tightened. "You think an apology erases what you've done? The harm you've caused? My family's been living in fear because of you." Greg flinched but nodded. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything." The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Ryan studied Greg's face, searching for sincerity. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was a start. "You want to make it right?" Ryan said finally. "Then come clean. Own up to what you've done, publicly." Greg hesitated, his face pale. "Publicly?" "Yes," Ryan said. "Admit what you've done, not just to us, but to this community. And if you're serious about making amends, you'll take responsibility for your actions." Greg swallowed hard, but after a long pause, he nodded. "All right, I'll do it." 2 days later, Greg stood on his porch, facing a small crowd of neighbors and reporters. His hands trembled as he held a piece of paper, his voice shaky as he began to read. "I'm here today to admit that I've made terrible mistakes," he said. "I've hurt people in ways that I can't take back. I allowed my anger and my prejudice to dictate my actions, and I'm deeply sorry for the harm I've caused." The crowd listened in stunned silence as Greg recounted his behavior, acknowledging the graffiti, the harassment, and the threats. It was a moment of reckoning, both for him and for the community that had enabled him. When he finished, Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. "Accountability isn't the end, it's the beginning. We can't change the past, but we can choose to do better moving forward. This neighborhood deserves to be a place where everyone feels safe and valued." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of solidarity washing over the cul-de-sac. For the first time in weeks, Ryan felt a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, change began to take root. Local leaders implemented new initiatives to address bias and promote inclusivity. Greg started attending community service programs, his once smug demeanor replaced by quiet humility. And though the scars of the past lingered, the neighborhood began to heal. One evening, as Ryan and Monica sat on the porch watching Thea play, Mrs. Harris walked over with a warm smile. "You've done something special here," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ryan nodded, his heart full. They had faced hatred and fear, but they had come out stronger. Their family, their community, and their resolve had grown in ways he hadn't thought possible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ryan looked at Monica and Thea, their laughter filling the air. It wasn't the fresh start they had envisioned, but it was a new beginning all the same, and for the first time, it felt like home. If this story made you think, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases. Share this video with your friends so that more people will know about these stories. And be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. Each story reveals something important. Write in the comments where you're watching from, and stay tuned.